in 1979, 6 weeks after having left the executive branch, I moved to Beijing, and we kind of represented the first group of foreign investors into China since the formation of the People's Republic of China 30 years prior to that, so in 1949. I think it's fair to say the relationships and the understanding between Chinese and Americans that came out of those investments that were formed by both the negotiation and the implementation of those investments built bridges between our two countries. 10 years ago, investment flows became two-way. Chinese companies began to invest here. What was a trickle has become a stream, and it's probably going to become a river. Chinese capital is providing 80,000 jobs today and will likely provide between 200 and 400,000 jobs at the end of this decade. It will change the way many Chinese and Americans think about each other. As a result of the experience which I had in the late 70s and the 80s, working with investors into China, and as a result of the experience of many of the National Committee members and directors investing in China, and because of the need to understand what this investment by China means in local communities around the United States, we decided to do a study on the effect of Chinese investment at the local level per congressional district. When we made that decision, it was easy to decide with whom we should work, because the Rhodium group is the best in the business. Today, Dan Rosen, who's a co-founder of the Rhodium Group, and Thilo Heinemann, who is director of research at the Rhodium Group, are here to talk about it. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to them to roll out this study. We'll then take some questions. Then we'll move on to a presentation by one of the largest Chinese investors in the United States, the chairman of Fuyao Glass. And then we'll have a panel which includes Dan, Thilo, me, one of America's leading experts on foreign direct investment, and the mayor of Thomasville, Alabama, that's a recipient of Chinese investment. So with no further ado, let me turn it over to Thilo and Dan, who have done a truly magnificent job on this study. Thanks, guys.
Steve, thank you so much, and it's such an honor and privilege to be part of the program here today for the National Committee as it warms up for year 50. It's such an important organization, and when Steve suggested that we try to find a way to put together the research Rhodium had in mind around these new flows of Chinese investment here, with the committee's desire to, as usual, find a way to dial down the anxiety based on sentiment and replace it with some thoughtful, considered basis for the United States and China to work through new issues and new challenges that arise as the relationship unfolds over the decades. I couldn't imagine a better undertaking for us to direct ourselves to. The sponsors for this study are very important, without which this kind of stuff doesn't happen. ACE, STAR, Ernst & Young, and Perfect World helped put together the resources to make this possible. I'm grateful for them. They're the kind of folks who really know more about what's happening on the ground than almost anybody else, because they're the ones who live it on the bottom line of their businesses. Outbound direct investment into the world has always been an important part of the American story. Some of our earliest settlements in this country, including the one underneath where you're sitting now called New Amsterdam, were in fact the assets of multinational corporations. who were getting legal corporate charters to go out and found new undertakings in the world economy 400 years ago. So down through the centuries and the decades since then, outbound direct investment from elsewhere in the world has continued to be a critical part of the American story, helping to deepen the industrial assets and potential of this country, enriching its technological capabilities. And then once America got to its stride, we turned around and became one of the most important global investors ourselves. The newest addition to that global story today is China. As much as we've talked about the global awakening of China for decades now, China as an outbound direct investor is really a very new story. Direct investment doesn't mean buying somebody else's treasury bonds. It means greenfield investments on the ground, building factories, buying expensive existing assets in a merger and acquisition transaction. That's very new for China even today. It's in its infancy as a global direct investor. But now already it's a very important story, including for the United States. Consider the bars on this chart. The first four concern things that have been happening for a long time. And in each case, we have a pair of bars. The first describing the change in U.S. China economic activity from 2000 and, I need to put my glasses on, Thilo, because did you use 2002 to 2007 versus the change in 2008 to 2013. So just to look at the first one there, Chinese exports to the United States. In that earlier 5-year period, they grew 157% over the period. In the more recent 5 years, that fell to just 30% growth. Likewise, U.S. exports to China, still growing at a healthy clip, 75% over that period, but that's less than half the growth rate of U.S. exports to China in the prior 5 years. Chinese holdings of U.S. securities, after an extraordinary period of growth in the early 2000s, are of course slowing. As things become saturated, China normally becomes wealthier. The stock of U.S. direct investment in China, similarly, extraordinary growth from the 1980s forward until pretty recently, but today slowing to a growth rate of only 14% in the stock of U.S. FDI in China over the past 5 years. The standout exception is the last pair of bars, Chinese FDI, foreign direct investment into the United States. From just 52% growth in that stock from 2002 to 2007, in the previous 5 years to date, we have 631% growth in the value of that investment. Thilo is going to get into it in great detail, but let me just point out to you that all these previous flows, all these other good things that have happened between our two economies, none of them entailed new assets coming to America. We had products that were cheaper, and hence our consumers could consume more than they otherwise would have been able to. We had American assets going to China, which was great for those companies and great for China in many ways. But this new element of the story we're talking about is the story of assets coming to our country and being placed here by citizens and the firms of another country. It's the first time that's been a key part of the story, and it's something to be excited about and feel good about. At the same time, of course, we know that the U.S. and China have a very complicated relationship. This is the first time the United States has hosted so much direct investment from a non-ally, a partner in many ways, but a non-ally partner out there in the world. And hence, in the slides you're about to see that describe the economic story, what we have to reconcile at the end of the day is that we have today less than 20% positive congressional attitudes about China. And as the numbers are going to show, 78% of all congressional districts in America are now hosting Chinese companies. So we have an extraordinary gulf between our feelings still about what it means to be in a world where China is an important player and the benefits that are now starting to become quite consequential in our local communities around the U.S. And to detail those a little bit, I'd like to ask my colleague Thilo to come up. Thank you.
As we see on this chart, Chinese investment in the United States has grown significantly over the past couple of years. And Dan and I, we've both spent a tremendous amount of time clarifying those patterns over the past couple of years. We have, since 2011, maintained a database that tracks each individual Chinese investment that's coming into the United States, both greenfield projects, so establishments that the Chinese companies build from scratch, and the acquisition of existing U.S. assets. Since 2000, we count about $46 billion worth of transactions coming from China to the United States. And as you can see, most of that amount, around 90% of it, happened over the past 5 years only. So it has indeed, as Steve mentioned, turned from a trickle into a stream already, and the trend is going up further. So while we know that Chinese investment is coming in, what we're not so sure about is what impact is this Chinese capital going to have on the U.S. economy. Some in the U.S. believe that Chinese FDI is going to have the same impact, the same benefits as FDI from other economies. A lot of people believe that Chinese investment is bad for the U.S. as an economy. And frankly, the majority just doesn't know. The reason is it's a new trend, as we've seen, and there's simply not enough research out there that looks specifically at the impact of Chinese companies and Chinese investment in the U.S. until today. What we have done for this study is we've taken our database on Chinese FDI transactions in the U.S. and we've broken it down by congressional district. So we present a picture of Chinese investment, Chinese establishments, and Chinese job provision in each of the 435 congressional districts in the United States. As you can see on this map, it is not just a story for East Coast or West Coast economies. It's a story that impacts all of America. We count that today already 340 of 435 congressional districts, around 80% of all districts are hosting Chinese companies in their neighborhoods. And it is a broad-based trend that we break further down into individual state profiles. So we provide a lot of detailed information on each individual state broken down by congressional district to make the operations of Chinese companies more transparent, to allow locals to track these companies, understand what they're doing in their home cities and hometowns, and establish a story and anecdotal evidence that these companies are beneficial to the local community. This is a perhaps surprising story. That's North Carolina, a state that has battled with the impacts of globalization for many, many years, has lost a lot of its textile industry, furniture industry, to countries like China. North Carolina is one of the top recipients of Chinese investment today. Around 15,000 people in the state alone are employed today by Chinese-owned companies. So it's a tremendous success story for the state of North Carolina. Same is true for the state of Ohio, for example, which is going to be the home of Fuyao Glass and other Chinese auto parts companies that are investing in not just purchases of existing U.S. companies, but also greenfield investments that are creating hundreds and thousands of new jobs in those states. We also have a couple of surprising results for states which we would have expected to attract a lot of Chinese investments, but that maybe are only at the beginning of this process. Washington is one example. It is a very globally minded state that has a lot of foreign investment overall, but it hasn't so far been very successful attracting a lot of Chinese companies. So another perspective for local officials to perhaps think about what other states are doing, and for local mayors and representatives to think about what their districts could do to host more of this new Chinese capital. Going back to the national level, one of the most important findings of our report is that while oftentimes the headlines in the papers are dominated by trophy purchases like the Waldorf Astoria, Chinese investment is not just going to the rich parts of the country. Chinese investment is a broad story, and in fact, the majority of Chinese capital is going to districts with low to medium household incomes. That is a very important finding. The most tangible benefit from a local perspective is, of course, jobs. And I think this is going to be the most broadly discussed number that is in our report. Our granular perspective allows us to present the first detailed assessment of Chinese jobs provision in the United States. So jobs that are directly associated with Chinese-owned companies in the US. We count that today, as of 2014, more than 80,000 Americans are employed by Chinese companies here in the US. That is up from less than 15,000 just 5 years ago. I have to say that this is a very conservative estimate, so we only count direct jobs. We don't include part-time employees. We also don't include indirect job creation, so at the construction phase or at suppliers. So this is a very conservative estimate. Another very important finding is that there are a lot of fears that Chinese acquisitions in the US could lead to the transfer of jobs, of US jobs, back to China. Chinese companies could purchase assets here and then take the technology, take the valuable brands, and ship it back to China. That is not happening. It's indeed the opposite. In the overwhelming majority of cases that we look at, Chinese acquisitions have resulted in additional job creation after a company was acquired here in the US, and this should contribute to a more balanced debate about Chinese acquisitions here in the US from a worker's perspective. The last important thing, finding that I want to mention, and especially in the context of current dynamics around intellectual property protection and espionage, is that while we still have the perception of China as a low-tech economy, and there are, no question, tensions about IPR protection, Chinese companies are becoming important contributors of local research and development spending here in the US. Chinese companies are increasingly ready to pay market prices for US technology assets. They're increasingly ready and able to maintain R&D operations in the US, and they're investing hundreds of millions of dollars every year on research and development activities in the US, utilizing the US labor force, utilizing existing clusters here in the US, and also utilizing the existing US system for intellectual property rights protection, which they don't have in the same way back in China. These are some of the benefits that I think are worth mentioning. We look at others, including export linkages in the report, but I'm going to turn it back to Dan now to talk a little bit about the potential for Chinese investment in the years ahead.
Thanks, Thilo. Just to finish up here in another two or 3 minutes or so, let's talk about the potential going forward, none of which is guaranteed to happen. And economists have ruined their reputations trying to project jobs gains from economic deepening between major economies. But if you want to play that game, because I'm not going to do it, sort of not going to do it, you would look at this. You would look at Japan as a direct investor in the United States from the 1980s. You think 80,000 jobs is a lot in America? Today, Japanese affiliated companies employ about 700,000 Americans. Those Japanese US companies doing R&D earn licensing fees for their American subsidiaries from back home in Japan. Those Japanese subsidiaries in America export from America. So much so that Fred Hochberg, who spoke with us here at the committee a couple years ago, is going around looking for Japanese and now Chinese companies to support as American exporters. That's very much in his remit. So that's what the patterns traditionally look like, and they are worth getting somewhat excited about. If we think about where China is as a global investor today, and we bravely project how much more Chinese outbound investment is going to take place in the years ahead because of the boldness of people like Chairman Cho, who's going to speak in a minute, you know, $700 billion of Chinese global investment is nothing compared to where China is headed. If it becomes just half normal, we'll see $2 trillion and then more of Chinese outbound investment around the world in 2020. And a good chunk of that has the potential to come to the United States. If we see the same Chinese interest in investing in America in the next 5 years, as we've seen in the last 5 years, then we're talking about, these are U.S. job projections here based on these scenarios, going from, say, 80,000 to, say, 200,000 or maybe even more Americans getting paychecks from Chinese affiliated companies. And that's something that I think any politician, whether local or national, understands the usefulness and the importance of pretty immediately. But let me finish with this by reminding you that none of this is a done deal yet. And it's not just a question of whether our local mayors get it right. They're not just competing with the mayor next door. The mayor is going to come on in a second, beat out Dallas to bring Hunan copper to one of the poorest counties in America, and shows what you can do. But they've now got to compete against Germans and Swiss and French and Australians and Canadians and people all over the world who are even, or at least as eager, I should say, at landing some of these investments as America is accustomed to trying to do. It's local officials competing in an international environment, in fact, and every level, every branch of the U.S. government will need to have a role to play to make it possible for hardworking local officials to win that fight, to win that battle, whether it's the executive branch, the legislative, or of course the Congress. We have agenda items like getting a bilateral investment treaty done, making sure we negotiate an opening door in China at the same time as ours stays opened so that we keep this a political feel-good story rather than getting hung up about asymmetries in how these investments are flowing. And of course, making sure that our courts back up the due process that America is famous for, so that if a Chinese company feels like it's mistreated by U.S. investment law, it can even take the White House to court and win. I'd like to see a lot of other countries in the world be able to show the same kind of patterns. You have your role to play here in the audience as well, as advisors and business people, public intellectuals, and interested citizens. You'll be involved in conversation about the United States and China in the future as you have been in the past. And I encourage you to have those conversations based as much as possible on the best available information on what's actually happening and what the local implications are, rather than just on gut feelings. Thanks very much, and thanks again, Steve, for making it possible to do this.
So we have Thilo and Dan, who you all know already, and we're now joined by Sheldon Day, who's served as the mayor of the city of Thomasville, Alabama since 1996. That means you're in your 19th year, and extraordinarily, in looking up your bio, you've had $700 million in capital investment during your time as mayor, which is truly extraordinary, and 1,000 new manufacturing and service sector jobs that he has created. So we'll hear more about that in a second. And then we're also joined by Aaron Brickman, who's one of America's leading experts on FDI into the United States. He's currently Senior Vice President of Strategy and Development at the Organization for International Investment. But prior to that, as Chairman Tsao mentioned in his comments, he was the Deputy Director of Select USA, which was created by the Obama administration under the Department of Commerce, charged with promoting and facilitating FDI into the United States. So let me start with you, Aaron, and ask to put this study in the context of kind of overall FDI in the United States.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I really must commend the National Committee on United States-China Relations and the Rhodium Group for publishing this report, setting aside the fact that this is something that I've requested for years, because it will be absolutely instrumental to telling this critical story on Capitol Hill, because nothing is understood quite like jobs in Congress by the district level. I think it will have an impact. It will have such an impact to make real what's happening in communities throughout our country. And I think what you just heard is an example of the growing sophistication on the part of Chinese executives with regard to navigating the United States. There's still a tremendous learning curve. So we take a step back. I think we've come a long way, but Chinese investment is pretty minimal in the United States. And the numbers are impressive, so $46 billion from 2000, but it really is still very little in comparison with our traditional investor nations. So this is pretty much Western Europe, it's Japan, it's Canada, it's even Australia. And some of those economies are quite small. Meanwhile, China significantly underweighted still in the United States. And a lot of comparisons with regard to the trajectory that Japanese industry has taken in terms of investing in the United States over decades. I think it's fair to say that China will do this in a quicker period of time. Key will be that delta between the high number of jobs and the low number of jobs. I think the slide really encapsulated it. And that's, I hope, one of the takeaways with regard to staffers and members on the Hill, because I think it tells just a powerful story. And there are a few things in terms of this context. So Select USA, which I helped to create. The United States has a very young history in terms of promoting and facilitating FDI at the national level. Meanwhile, all along, our cities and our states, counties, and regions have been in that leadership role. Working for many years, of course, they wouldn't have had any reason to look at China for inbound investment. Now, certainly, there is such a reason. And we're going to hear a great story, I think, in a moment when I'm done talking. We look at what Select USA does. There's a substantial China engagement. And of course, that didn't exist before 2011. So U.S. diplomats were not formally incentivized to promote the United States as a destination for global capital, for direct investment. So this has changed. It surprises many that the United States was the last OECD country to have an investment promotion agency. So this context is important, but until relatively recently, Chinese firms could not invest cross-border. So the learning curve is still very high, and there are still a small number of Chinese companies that are household brand names, very small. A small number of Chinese companies, I think, at a large scale that have really done this successfully. I have to say, not pandering to our esteemed speaker, but Fuyao absolutely is a best practice. And I will have the honor of touring their still to be completed facility in Dayton next week. The competition for FDI is tremendous. And so our mayors, our governors, lieutenant governors, heads of economic development organizations are not only competing with one another, but they're competing with their peers from around the world for this same capital. So yes, there's more Chinese investment going outbound, that's for sure. Yes, there's more coming into the United States. I know the nuance of this year is not as positive in terms of flow. But what's increasing is the geographic, the ties that these deals are increasingly geographically agnostic. They don't have to come to the United States. So this level of competition will only increase. And that's why I think we're really talking about the beginning. So this report, I think, launches some great data and will spur this debate. And so a final point I would just raise in terms of context is my organization. So not an advertisement, but we have 170 members. Arguably the largest, most sophisticated, most successful U.S. subsidiaries of global companies. 2 are Chinese subsidiaries. That's Smithfield and Lenovo. 2. So it's dominated by European, Canadian, Japanese, and some Australian, as I was saying earlier. It mirrors traditional FDI in the United States. And as the face of FDI changes, I think so too will our membership. But one of the things missing, one of the things that requires this report and your organization's robust engagement is that with that learning curve, conquering the learning curve, comes understanding how successful companies from anywhere, U.S. homegrown, U.S. subsidiaries of global companies, do it in the United States. It's hiring advisors, and you heard that from the chairman. and it's telling the story. And that might involve playing a role in the U.S. political process, and I think that's really important. So I think I'll stop there, but the context is so important.
Great opening comments. Let me turn to Mayor Day and ask you to tell the story of this extraordinary investment. Now, the city is in southwest Alabama.
Correct.
And what's its population?
Population's 5,000 people.
And tell us about Golden Dragon and their decision to invest in your neighborhood. And how did it get started? How was the decision made? And how has it changed your community?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you and this wonderful organization for the awesome invitation that I've received to come and be a part of this program. It's not many small-town mayors that get to come to New York and participate in events like this. You know, from where we are, our relationship now with our Chinese friends has grown, and so now but we're still in the South, so we say ni hao y'all. So ni hao y'all, and we're so glad to be here with you. It started out actually because of an EB5 project that was being done in our community. There was a project that was looking at some EB5 funding, and so a gentleman named Ray Chang from China, from Hong Kong, was contracted to come and vet that EB5 project for investors in China. And he came to our community. He actually came on December the 3rd, and it was the day of our Christmas parade in our community. And he called me the night before. He said, "Can I come down and visit with you? I want to talk to you about Thomasville and see if it warrants this investment." And I said, "Sure. Hey, when do you want to come?" He said, "How about tomorrow?" And I said, "Well, tomorrow we have our Christmas parade." I said, "But you're welcome to come and you can ride with me in the Christmas parade." So he rode with me in the Christmas parade and he waved at everyone. And I know everybody in Thomasville, our little small town, was wondering who this Chinese guy is riding with the mayor in the Christmas parade. But he came and we became friends. The EB5 project did not move forward at the particular time, but we became friends and began talking with each other. And within a few months, his wife does work, financial work. She's an MBA, and she does work with companies and helping them go private in China and in the U.S. And so Golden Dragon had contacted them and had been talking with them about this project, and they asked him to begin the process of looking and locating a site for this project. So he contacted me and he said, "Hey, are you interested in an industry?" And I said, "I'm always interested in industry for our community and for our region." You got to understand, Thomasville, although we're a small town, we're in the middle of a huge rural region. We're basically halfway between Tuscaloosa and Mobile. We're 100 miles from anybody, but we kind of like to say that we're the center of the universe. And you can get to anywhere from Thomasville, so we think we're the center of the universe. And we also have a new slogan. We think it's cool to be rural, okay? Because what do you folks who live in a big city do, okay, on the weekends? You want to go where? You want to get the heck out of Dodge and go where? To a rural area, to a lake, to hiking or whatever. So why not live in a rural area? And then when you want to go to the big city occasionally, you can go whenever you want. So, that's kind of our philosophy in Thomasville. But we began working with Ray. They put out an RFP. 62 different cities responded to the RFP from North Carolina all the way to Texas. And we began working. And I asked Ray, I had not had a lot of interaction with Chinese folks of Chinese descent. I had no idea how to begin the process. So I asked him for advice. And one thing I learned very quickly, I was making these, they were coming to visit our community, I was making these huge banners. I wanted to make these huge banners and welcome them to our community, and I found out real quick, you do not put black lettering on white banners. Because my Chinese friends will tell you, black lettering on white banners are used only for funerals in China. So I learned that very quickly. We had the banners, we had to redo the banners and put a new color and all that kind of thing. So. We had good intentions, but we learned. So we learned a lot of the cultural things as we went. But one thing we found that we decided to do economic development a different way. We do economic development from our heart. We want people to come to our community, regardless of whether they're Chinese investment, U.S. investment, or others, to come to our community, be part of us and us part of them. To grow with our community and help our children, who up until the last few years have been our #1 export. Because many of you from China know what I'm talking about. Many of you grew up in a rural area, and where do you live now? You live in the city. And so we wanted an opportunity to keep some of our children at home. And so that's been my passion for 19 years as mayor, is to create more opportunities for our children and keep them at home. And so that's how we began this process, RFP process, and we did these tours, and it came down between Thomasville, Alabama, Dallas, Texas, and Little Rock, Arkansas. And I will tell you that Bill Clinton himself called Chairman Lee, the chairman of this company, 3 times, trying to get him to go to Arkansas. And we won. But I believe the reason we won was because of our ruralness and our uniqueness and our willingness to make them part of our family, make them part of us. We want you to be part of our Alabama family. Now, you hear a lot of negative things about Alabama. I started to bring my Bubba teeth with me today to put in my mouth so you could, I don't know if you know what Bubba teeth are, but usually when they put somebody on the television from Alabama, it's the worst looking fella in the world, and his teeth are all crossed up and problems, so that's what we call Bubba teeth. But we wanted them to feel very welcome in Alabama, and you got to look at, and I want to talk to the chairman about bringing his next investment, a glass investment, to Alabama. Alabama is now the 2nd largest manufacturer of automobiles in the U.S. Wow. We're the second, have more automobiles, the 2nd highest automobile manufacturing in the company, and that just started in 1986. So we had 0 in 1986. So Alabama's done a lot of great things. But getting back to that story, when we talked to the chairman, when we looked at him and they came to visit, we rolled out the red carpet. Number one, we contacted some friends in New York to get tea, Chinese tea, shipped in, because we didn't want him to we wanted him to see that we were serious about Chinese investment, that we cared enough to bring tea from New York to Thomasville, Alabama, and get some advice on how we should prepare it. And we actually had homemade Lazy Susans made for the tables, so that, and we had the meal served like a traditional Chinese meal, so that we wanted them to understand that we went the extra mile to make sure that we understood more about their culture, because we wanted them to feel welcome and welcome in our family, in our community. And I told the chairman and the group that came, I said, if Dallas and Little Rock or anyone else is the best place to go for your company, if that is the place that makes the most economic sense for your company, then that's where you should go. But if you want to do something special, and I get choked up when I say this because it is truly special, and come to a small town where you can grow with us, where we can grow with you, where we'll hold each other's hands as we learn this process, because they had a lot to learn about doing business in the U.S., and we wanted to help them. And where you'll be this great big fish in this real small pond, and where your entire management team will be known to everyone in our community, and your plant manager will go to a local grocery store and be recognized, and a grandma will walk up to him and pat him on the back and say, "Sir, thank you for hiring my grandson." To me, that is the most special way that we could evolve this project, and ironically, that has actually happened. We've had grandmas pat these guys on the back and thank them for hiring their grandchildren, and that's what's really evolved and helped us become successful as a community. We've learned a lot along the way. I've been to China 3 times in the last 2 years. to learn more. And I think that this is a great opportunity for us. We had some challenges. We had some people that were like, you know, the Chinese are coming, the Chinese are coming. You know, they didn't know how to act. They didn't know how to accept this investment. But when they found out that Alabamians, our folks, were going to be the people who receive the jobs, then it's become a great project for us. This project, actually, our city is bordered by Wilcox County. We're in Clark County, but Wilcox County's 7/10 of a mile, less than a mile from our city limits. Wilcox County is the poorest county in Alabama and the 14th poorest county in the United States. Had the highest unemployment in Alabama and one of the top 5 in the entire United States. I'm proud to say today that they have over 200 employees, and they just authorized hiring of another 110, in the process of hiring another 110. Unemployment continues to drop in the community, and it's transforming this region, not just Thomasville. Thomasville's always been a very progressive community, but the much poorer areas, what we call the Black Belt of Alabama, which is much like the Mississippi Delta as far as poverty. And we're seeing more and more transformations happen. High schools and community colleges now are networking with each other to make sure we're teaching manufacturing techniques in our high schools. We're doing many, many other things to prepare our children. What do we need to do to prepare our children for these manufacturing jobs so that they can stay home? And we're seeing more and more happen. And over the next 5 to 10 years, I'm very excited about the possibilities of where we're going to go in the future.
Well, I've thought of a new question as you've made this presentation, which is, when are you running for governor? This is an urban environment, but I'm sure you have a lot of votes in this.
I haven't thought about running for governor in New York, but I might consider it.
We'd love your accent. We'd love your accent.
If Hillary could be our senator.
That's right. That's right. Talk about Little Rock. So, just briefly, tell us about kind of how you and I had spoken about the number of people who were working for the facility now who come off of like government assistance and kind of lifted people out of poverty and got them working and got their kids back in kind of a positive, constructive relationship.
Many of the people who live in Wilcox County have been on have basically been welfare families, basically have lived off of government assistance most of their lives. In fact, it's generational. There's been multiple, probably 3 generations of people who have lived off government assistance because that's all they've ever known. Many of them are single parent families, single mothers, who, because of being a single parent, they've struggled in trying to take care of their children and work and do all those things. So at times it became easier for them to just stay home and not work so that they can make sure their children were taken care of. So there's been many. In fact, the last numbers that I've gotten from them, 60% of the people who work at this plant are minorities. 60% are women. Most of them, I would say 75 to 80% of those women are single parent mothers. And we've seen a tremendous opportunity for us to bring people and teach them how to come off of welfare and how to get a good job and sustain that job and sustainability. And this has taken a collaborative effort between our school systems, our Department of Human Resources efforts where they basically get their welfare. We've partnered with them to get more of those folks trained. We have what we call Alabama Career Centers. They've gotten involved. The community colleges have gotten involved. The state has brought in special training facilities to what we call pre-employment training. Alabama has what they call AIDT, which is Alabama Industrial Development Training, but there are minimum requirements for you to be able to get into that program, such as you must have a minimum of a high school diploma or a GED. Many of these people didn't have that. So we wanted to get them ready. And so a year and a half out, when the project first began construction, knowing that it's going to be a year and a half before we started these programs right away and started getting people engaged in these programs. And I'm pleased to say that, you know, people say that there's this fallacy around the country today, and I will say that I'm a Republican, but I will tell you this: there is a fallacy among my party and others who says that people don't want to work. We had job fairs in Camden, Alabama, which is in the heart of Wilcox County, and over 2,000 people, and there's only 11,000 people in this county. 2,000 people showed up to sign up for a job.
Quite
so
amazing story.
It's opportunities will allow you to move forward and do some great things in those poor communities.
Aaron, it's such a positive story. Where's the opposition? What are people afraid of?
Yeah, well, so yeah, it's a poignant question. So much is written and talked about with regard to the U.S. China relationship. FDI, these cases where there's job creation and CapEx coming into communities, this is the non-adversarial part of what has become. And during your annual meeting, you know, I heard a little bit of a flavor for how much work you all are doing and thinking about this, but this is the non-adversarial part of an adversarial relationship. And there is no faster way to change attitudes about China here in the U.S. than job creation. It's economic development, and every mayor in the United States feels a responsibility, I think, and very few have been as successful as this man. But they all feel a responsibility to work to create jobs, regardless of where those jobs come from, regardless of where the capital originates. They have that responsibility. And so by not attracting FDI, by not working with their states or with the federal government, they're leaving jobs on the table. And there are certainly other communities and economic development leaders that want to fill that gap. So the opposition comes from this feeling of the unknown or the other, and this desire to have a boogeyman to point to and to look at and to talk about, and there are political points that can be scored by talking about China in negative terms. But I think what we have seen, and some of those logos next here in Michigan, higher in South Carolina, Lenovo, and what didn't happen, right? So there were all these assumptions about what was going to happen, asset draining, moving everything to China. That just did not occur. So people learn, but so I think opposition is tough to keep up in the face of reality. But we have not seen the end of it, and because we have really just not seen the end of opposition, right, because we have really only just seen the beginning of Chinese investment in the United States. And so I think we do need to brace ourselves and combat this continuous myth creation with facts.
Absolutely.
Dan.
I want to add one quick thought on that. You know, when authors, when researchers sit down to try to conceptualize a new study, you can't see the whole thing as it's going to look with all the numbers and charts and tables. You start with a small idea, and the small idea we started with for this one was, what could we do that would put ammunition in the hands of a local American official that would help him get something done that he couldn't otherwise get done? And at the end of the day, we said, there's two ways that something like this can be used. You can take it to China to convince people that the U.S. is open to Chinese investment, that you're not going to be left to hang in the wind, as a few Chinese companies were in the early days, that you are going to be standing with people you know that are going to be, you know, almost like family, as you say, Mayor, number one. And number two, you can take that same report to Washington and talk to your federal officials who have all sorts of sometimes vague reasons not to do something. And you can actually point to the benefits and say, that's fine, I understand you have reasons to be concerned about things that you can't put your finger on, but here's concrete numbers that matter an awful lot back in the district. So if you're going to mess this up for me, you better have a better reason to do it than, I'm not sure I like the cut of their jib, or whatever you guys say down Alabama way.
I will add to that too. In the beginning, we had some congressmen and senators that were supportive, but they wanted to kind of take the back seat. They didn't want to be out front. But they 100% of them were there the day we cut the ribbon on a $100 million facility in Wilcox County. So you know, when you start cutting ribbons and you start seeing things happen, the politicians want to be there. And there is a lot of rhetoric, and we've had to explain that to some of our Chinese friends. They said, well, you're so nice. Well, why is Senator so-and-so talking so bad about us, you know, back in the U.S.? They're more educated about what our American politicians say than we are at times.
Any evidence, Thilo and Dan, that these investments are politically driven, put in districts where there's an important senator, an important congressman, or is it really relationship and business driven?
There is so far no evidence that any of that investment is politically placed in districts with committee leaders or other important DC politicians. It's really a trend that's driven by commercial incentives, commercial motives, local relationships, and the efforts by mayors and federal officials that are trying to attract these investments from China. So no, so far there's no evidence at all for the idea that it's a monolithic state or it's driven by a central bureaucratic entity in China.
Was the Japanese experience different?
Right. I mean, it really, Steve, reminds us to be careful not to over-extrapolate from the Japanese experience. So we put a set of Japanese lines up for you to see to help think about things. But whereas when one looked at where Japanese plants landed around the U.S. in the 80s and early 90s, well, coincidentally, they were all in powerful committee chairmen's districts. The very guys in D.C. who were threatening dumping duties and hanging other swords over the heads of Japanese firms. We didn't really know what this map was going to look like when we started down the path here. That was a little bit of a risk you took, by the way. I'm not sure we told you that. We didn't know what the story was going to actually tell. We look at it now, and it tells a story Thilo told in terms of the, dividing U.S. districts by income level. It's not the most powerful areas of the country where this is happening. It's not the committee chairmans. We list out very clearly who are the winningest federal politicians in America in terms of landing this stuff, and there's almost no chairman or very powerful committee assignments there. It's spread all over the country, and the only thing it really reflects is where there are Chinese companies that are ready to go global and do more than just make pipe back in Hunan, but they want to get ahead of their competitors and be what they've seen American companies and European companies be while they've been growing up. They want to do that now. So that's really the story we see when we look at the map, rather than something that follows that closely the Japanese pattern.
I have another dozen questions, but this is our members meeting. So do we have some handheld mics in the room? Okay, we've got some handheld mics, so if you would put up your hand, I would be happy to recognize you, and you can, right here. I can't see who it is because there's a bit of a glare. So identify yourself. It's not on.
There we go.
Yep, it's on.
Test it.
It always happens.
Yeah.
Hi, PD Shaw, PDS Capital Management. I was wondering, you talked a lot about FDI, foreign direct investment in the U.S. by China, yet the Chinese government recently established a rival to the IMF. And I was wondering if there's some kind of dichotomy there between what the Chinese government is trying to do in terms of FDI, yet establishing a competitor to the IMF, basically.
Well, there's not too much to that line, I don't think. I mean, the only parallel here is that, as we said before, there's a lot of things, despite we think of China as very globalized, there's a lot of things it doesn't do globally yet. One of them is invest much in OECD advanced economies, and that's starting to change. And the other is take a more active role in the international organizations that run the global system, like the IMF and other regional development organizations. It is now very strongly and ardently expressing a desire to have a larger role. They've been told their voting share would be increased, and that hasn't been offered to them yet to do. And so they're trying to find other ways to do it. And so we'll see a bunch of things happening differently from, this won't be our grandfather or our father's China anymore. It's a different China, and we'll have to react to it differently. I think that's the principal insight there.
Bob?
This is Bob Peterzak from Sidley Austin, member of the board. What is being done at this point to get this report before the Senate and the House? And do you see this as having an effect on TPP?
We were in Washington yesterday, and through our relationship with the U.S. China Working Group and through our own network, because we've now taken over 200 staff and members to China, we reached out to them and we gave a presentation similar to what you heard today on the Hill. In terms of TPP, I think this is much more a BIT, a bilateral investment treaty story. That it's a story that, you know, there are great benefits to the United States in having it, but there are great benefits to China. It's one, I know we have representatives of the Chinese government here, and I hope as you see this report, you report back to Beijing and say, it's really important that we have a short negative list so that we can negotiate the bilateral investment treaty, because it really will benefit Chinese investment in the United States and therefore benefit constructive U.S.-China relations. That the BIT, which is so important, you know, we hope when Carla and Ernie Thrasher and several others were in China, we had our meetings in January on the economic dialogue, we were very hopeful that there would be significant progress on the negotiation of the bilateral investment treaty, because it's a win-win. It really is a win-win, but we have not seen that progress. So I hope the message that you take home from this, take back to Beijing, is make some progress on the BIT. It makes my job easier. Mike.
Mike Lampton. Mayor, I'd be interested in how you worked with other county leaders, I guess it was Wilcox County, and the governor, and how many points of facilitation did you find you needed with the federal government, or is in fact the federal government for the kind of thing you're talking about important in one sense, but day to day not all that important?
That's a good question. One thing that we found with our Chinese friends is they were caught up on, they felt that the need to deal with a community that they felt the need to deal directly with the federal government, okay? Because their idea of when they get approval for a project in China, basically the central government's got to sign off on it, correct? So there sometimes Golden Dragon's thought was, well, we need to talk to U.S. Department of Commerce first before we decide where we're going to go, to make sure that they okay with it. Well, the U.S. Department of Commerce hadn't got a clue.
Careful.
Right?
Well, they didn't go to Aaron.
What
They should have gone to Aaron.
You know, I mean, that's the reason of Select USA. In fact, that's one of the main reasons that they decided to do Select USA, because there needs to be a more open relationship with the Department of Commerce and people who want to do business here, because there is this misconception about how you do business. And yes, the U.S. Department of Commerce is important, but what I'm saying is when it comes down to a deal and getting a deal done, it's going to be between a city, a mayor, and the company, with the state's assistance, with the federal government assistance, basically a bottoms-up approach instead of a top-down approach. It's totally opposite of China. And so having them understand that is, but we brought those officials on board. The governor was on board in the beginning. Governor Bentley had been in office for 2 days. He hadn't even been inaugurated yet. He had just gotten inaugurated. The next day, I asked him to do dinner with us and our Chinese friends, and he did a wonderful job. And we came down and did that. Plus, we had our senators and our congressmen on board. Alabama has a very good congressional delegation. They work very closely together. When it comes down between Alabama and another state, everybody's on board, and they do their job, and they do it well, and they bring everybody else to the table to help us. So they did a great job.
Anla, and then Jerry Cohen. Anla's in the middle there in the white. You can pass it.
Thank you. I have several questions to Rhodium. Earlier you said that the Japanese have created
Just speak a
700,000
little
jobs.
louder.
700,000 jobs in the United States. Can you shed some light on how many jobs other foreign countries have created? Let's say the OECD, the Europeans. How many jobs have they created in the United States? And the second question is, earlier you said that 40% of Americans, or those who you surveyed, said they don't know whether Chinese FDI is good or bad. And I don't blame them. With, for instance, today's top headline on the front page was that there were spies, Chinese spies, that came to the United States. So how do you shake that myth that you're hiring all these people from China and that they're not spies? How do we go about correcting that myth?
You can pass the microphone to Jerry over there. But go ahead, answer.
Sure.
Do you want to respond to the first
So
question?
just quick response on the numbers. UK is the largest foreign direct investor nation in the United States. About 1 million American workers are employed by U.S. subsidiaries of UK firms. Then comes Japan, about a little less than 700,000. And then numbers 3 through 7, it varies, but that's going to be Germany, Switzerland, France, and Netherlands. That's between 150 and 300,000 jobs, depending on, some of them are heavy in financial services, heavy retail presence, so it can be tens of thousands of jobs for some of those firms. But Japan is absolutely ensconced at number 2 in terms of CapEx and jobs by far.
Just one comment on the second question. I think in times like this, where we have a lot of negative stories come out on the U.S.-China political relationship, it is even more important to share stories like this, right? We need to tell the positive aspects of U.S.-China economic relations. And I think one of the contributions that we make is to really provide the facts. And that's what's largely been missing in the past when we talk about Chinese investments. There was no cost really on either turning your back to it or opposing it, bashing deals, politicizing deals. Members of Congress, others have been doing it without any cost related to it. Now there's a cost attached to that, and people can point to it. And one thing we're actually going to do is we're going to go to local media a lot, to regional newspapers, local newspapers, and share those stories, give them those numbers so they report on what Chinese companies are doing in their districts, and that people start asking questions in Washington to their representative and ask them, what are you doing to help us bring those companies in there? And so I think by sharing these numbers, we really tell that story, which will add some ballast to the U.S.-China relationship to counter some of these negative narratives that we have coming up recently.
Jerry.
As Steve said at the beginning, 36 years ago, he and I hoped that bringing foreign direct investment to China would have a good political impact on the development toward a freer system, a more pluralistic system in China. I compliment the makers of this report on pondering the implications of the beginnings of foreign investment in the United States. I'd like to see another report, however, that would analyze the pros and cons of huge amounts of Chinese investment in this country. What would be the political implications? For example, I'm disturbed that some of the leading human rights advocates in Washington have told me in the last few years it's much harder to get congressmen interested in speaking out about human rights violations in China. And the situation in China, as China develops its economy and its political prominence, is getting worse with respect to repression, and matters that we hoped foreign business would improve in China. So it would be good to get the views of the group here about what are the political implications, because there are obviously good implications as well as negative ones. But I'm concerned to get people to think about what will Chinese influence be on the American Congress or on state legislatures 10, 20 years down the line as this wave of foreign direct investment comes to America. China is the first foreign investor to be a dictatorship. Japan was a democratic country. The Western European countries were democratic countries. We have a new dimension to ponder with respect to Chinese investment in the U.S.
Thank you, Jerry. Any comment that starts, I'd really like to see another study sponsored, is a good comment in my book. But look, every day we debate, argue, think about, worry about, hope about all these different aspects of the agenda. The U.S. China agenda, the China global agenda, if we're China generalists. All we've done here is add more factual information that can be used to wrestle with this piece of the story, this piece of the puzzle with this study. That's the contribution of it. There are lots more things to be written about the political impact of Chinese direct investment as opposed to other investors previously. Jerry, in earlier studies we did on this topic, we had longer historical reviews and looked at the heated debate in the United States in the 1790s about whether to let the British invest in steel mills in America, because those dictators would use them to make more cannonballs to use against us if we went back to war. After the First World War and before the Second, there was a heated debate about whether to allow Bayer Chemical and lots of other German chemical companies that were the dominant global chemical industry, the Germans, between the wars, to invest in the United States. Because what would happen if we ever got into another tiff with our German friends? Well, as it turned out, what would happen is you'd nationalize their chemical companies and put them to American purposes immediately. We had this debate in terms of Arab petrodollars being recycled into the United States in the 70s. All dictatorships, of course, or however you like to characterize them. So it's really not the first time that we've had to decide whether we want to grade FDI at the border based on some discrete national security concern or a much wider set of American considerations. Other countries, the Canadians, for example, have a net benefits test to look more broadly at whether it's in the Canadian interest to allow foreigners to invest. That's been used to keep Americans out from time to time as well when we were perceived as too competitive. We haven't done it that way. For most of our history, it's made us the paragon of global market leadership and what it means to be a dynamic economy. And as an economist, I prefer that we stick to that line. But the questions of China's particular size do require another study, Steve. So let's talk about that at dinner.
At great risk to myself, because I have my treasurer, the secretary, and one of my most important directors still with their hands up with questions, but we have reached the appointed time. So to end, so I will have to take your criticisms for not recognizing you earlier. But this has been a very interesting, lively, and informative discussion. I thank you all for coming to our 49th annual meeting, and thank you for all participating.